set in the East Berlin Theatre, as well as in the state-owned DEFA film studios in Potsdam-Babelsberg that had once been the famous UFA Dream Factory. In its 1920s heyday, classics such as The Blue Angel, Nosferatu and Metropolis had been filmed at Babelsberg, and in the 1930s, under the tutelage of propaganda minister Goebbels, such notorious films as Jew Süß and the pro-euthanasia Ich klage an, I accuse. The actor's problem was that this weekend he had invited his teenage nephew, Till Meyer, to stay. Till's war-widowed mother, with whom the boy lived the rest of the time, was still resident in West Berlin. Breakfast time found Till's communist uncle more subdued than usual. "Is there going to be a war?" Till asked. The older man had no clear answer. Both of them were wondering how young Till was going to get back to his mother. The uncle switched frantically between RIAS and East German radio, trying to make sense of what had happened at the sector border during the night. The Politburo and its servants rarely, in their public pronouncements, referred to a war or anything similar. The preferred euphemism was the bland phrase, "Measures for carrying out the decision of the Council of Ministers of the 12th of August 1961. It made interpreting what was actually going on a little hard. "Yes, it's certainly a serious situation," he announced, finally hitting on an appropriately grave tone. "Obviously, our state is no longer prepared to allow the West to keep plundering the GDR." He had now figured out the political aspect to his own satisfaction. But what to do? He told his nephew to pack his things. In the meantime, he would call his party friends in Berlin to see how things really stood. To ring Berlin entailed an hour's trek to the nearest phone bank. While his uncle was away, Till packed his red checked duffel bag, then sat down and listened to the radio. There were crowds assembling on the Potsdamer Platz and in front of the Brandenburg Gate, tanks in the back streets, and barriers being erected on the rail tracks in the north of Berlin. Waiting anxiously for his uncle's return, Till stepped outside into the lakeside greenery, but heard only the distant quack of ducks, the wind in the trees, and the twitter of the birds. The dramatic scenario outlined on the radio seemed to belong in another world. Around 1 that afternoon, his uncle reappeared, looking far from happy. He had no idea, he said, what was going to happen next. The best thing would be if Till got going as soon as possible and just went back home as he had come, by a combination of ferry, bus and S-Bahn, and no dilly-dally. So the teenager began his journey back, he hoped, to the west. The route was quite lengthy. Over on the ferry to the far shore, and a 15-minute walk carrying his stuff to the bus station in Ransdorf, followed by 20 minutes on the bus to the S-Bahn station. Already on the platform of this usually quiet suburban stop, Till noticed a lot of people waiting apprehensively for the westbound train. Many like him were Westerners, caught here while on weekend visits to families or friends. Once the train arrived, it was 18 stops on the east-west line to the Ostkreuz junction. Here Till changed onto a line that usually took him straight over the border into West Berlin. There were many worried, bad-tempered people on this train. A grumpy old man, a blonde woman with children who kept bursting into tears and wondering if the kids would ever see their grandparents again. At Treptower Park, last stop before West Berlin, instead of a loudspeaker warning the passengers, "Achtung, you are now leaving the democratic sector of Berlin," the train stopped with a peculiarly final clunk. Then came an announcement that no one had heard before. "End of the line! End of the line! The train ends here!" The passengers emerged warily onto the platform. Black uniformed truckles hauled at the Easterners to go about their business, the Westerners to proceed to the crossing point at Praxisstrasse, where if their papers were in order, they would be permitted to enter West Berlin. Everyone stumbled in that direction with their luggage, as instructed. The old man from the train, obviously a Westerner, was among those who made their way, sweating in the August heat, several blocks to the designated crossing point. As they came within sight of the new barbed wire barrier, the old man extracted from his bag a couple of East German sausages, which he tossed furtively into the front garden of a nearby apartment block. "Don't want to give them an excuse to arrest me for smuggling," he muttered. Crowds of East Berliners milled at a safe distance from the armed border guards and the barbed wire, discussing the situation. The Westerners kept their heads down. They could see people leaning out of the windows of apartment blocks in the east, some out on their balconies, many calling over to the western side, just a couple of 100 yards away, or waving handkerchiefs. Approaching the crossing point, Till spotted tanks of the East German People's Army parked discreetly to the left and right of the border approaches, their turret guns pointed westwards. In the actual area of the border stood heavily armed men in steel helmets, who looked as if they meant business. Construction workers were already busy at the sector border, drilling holes for concrete posts as they inserted into the common street. On arrival at the barbed wire, the Westerners showed their identity cards to the armed border police. It was a tense moment. The young guards were just as nervous as they were. However, once their ID was accepted, the crude barrier was eased apart, and they were let through to West Berlin. It still felt somewhat primitive, the whole new control arrangement, a clumsy, uncertain beginning to something that would one day be far more malevolently sophisticated and permanent. What they were creating here would become a symbol for the wanton division and cruelty, and not love. On the western side, the Harzstrasse also here. They worked off their frustration by calling insults to the Eastern Guards and chanting slogans. Down with the pointy beard, old great murderer, Budapest, Budapest, Budapest! Eastern Guards and Western demonstrators were roughly the same age. Till did not turn back. He kept walking until he got to the next S-Bahn station in the West Berlin borough of Kreuzberg. From there, he took a train to Friedenau, where his mother was waiting anxiously for him. Also, on the green edge of East Berlin, a young man a couple of years Till's senior was likewise holed up in a country cottage. Unlike Till, he was an East Berliner, though one of a rather complicated sort. And also, unlike Till, he was in the full glorious flower of his first grown-up love affair. Klaus Schultz-Ladergast was 19 years old and thinking about his future, that is, his planned studies, which he hoped to commence this coming winter, and besides that, the life he had in mind with his new girlfriend, with whom he was spending the weekend at Durham. They too had listened to the radio and realized something big was happening. But being in love and feeling that nothing could hurt them, they joked about it. Oh no, he said, I won't be able to get the wood-handled, strong West German cigarettes that I like to smoke. Even worse, she countered, this is the end of my supply of decent stockings from West Berlin. Klaus's background was unusual. His father, a former army officer, was also a leading lay official in the Lutheran Church in East Germany, just about to take an important post as vice chair of the church community in Cheltenham. Klaus himself, though brought up in East Berlin, had attended high school in West Berlin, where he had passed his leaving examination a few months previously. Then he had come back. It had been tempting to stay in West, but at this point he didn't want to. West Berlin's east was gorgeous. The east was the old heart of Berlin. The best theatres and pubs. Klaus liked the bohemian life, and East Berlin at the turn of the 1960s seemed much more interesting, full of rebels and writers, actors and artists, exotic foreign students from the Third World, studying in the city with the help of generous scholarships provided by the communist authorities. Many of his East German friends were privileged children of the GDR's elite, including, for instance, Brigitte, the writer-daughter of Interior Minister Karl Lauer. And after all, the way to the West was just a matter of crossing the street. One could live in the East and enjoy the best of both worlds. This young man was looking forward to studying and living a full, exciting, metropolitan life. Klaus didn't know three things. First, that from now on, in the new closed-off East Germany, anyone who had chosen to study in the West would be suspect and thereby severely disadvantaged. Second, that the Stasi was already fully aware of the man whom Klaus had introduced to his father a few months before. The man from West German intelligence who was interested in having occasional talks with Herr Schultz-Ladergast Sr. about relations between the Lutheran Church and the communist state. Within a few days, Klaus Schultz-Ladergast would realize both these things. The third realization would take much, much longer to sink in. It was that 30 long years would pass before he set eyes again on the woman with whom he had spent that last idyllic August weekend before the war went up. Chapter 10. Prisoners. There were two striking sets of images that the world found itself focusing on in print or in flickering black and white during the days that followed the building of the barrier that would become the Philippine War. The first set showed ordered ranks of armed East German soldiers, police and paramilitaries, and barbed wire being rolled out to sever the nerve networks of a great modern city, posts being driven like nails into Berlin's prostrate body. Erich Honecker's Operation Rosa in all its totalitarian, machine-like efficiency. The second set was the terrible, messy human side. People fleeing or trying to flee as the barrier closed, making dashes towards the western side, encouraged by watching crowds. Human beings waving, calling, holding up children and pets, making final vain attempts to get close to people they were beginning to realize they might not see again for years, perhaps forever. Worst of all, most heartrending, were the scenes in and around the Bernauer Strasse. The Bernauer Strasse was in the borough of Bredon, in the French sector. Just. This soon-to-be notorious street began at the Nordbahnhof S-Bahn station and ran northeast from there for about 1.5 kilometers until it hit the corner of Eberswalder and Schwedlerstrasse, where the wall turned north along the eastern edge of what for many years had been a busy marshalling yard and was now essentially no man's land between east and west. It formed the near straight advanced edge of a 3 or 4 city block square area that jutted into the east. Those who lived in that area were surrounded on 3 sides by communist territory. By a quirk of the settlement that established the district boundary of Greater Berlin in 1920, the Bernauer Strasse itself was divided between the districts of Bredon and Mitte, Berlin centre. Bredon lay in the west, in the French sector, while Mitte was in the east. For the first 300 or 400 meters of the street, coming up from the Nordbahn, the border ran along the edge of the cemetery belonging to the Sophiankirche congregation. This was followed by another cemetery belonging to the Elisabeth Himmelfahrt, Ascension of Elizabeth congregation. These two sets of permanent inhabitants might reasonably be expected to have gone beyond caring whether they were communist or capitalist. But when blocks of 19th century apartments began to line the street on both sides, filled with live human beings, the situation changed. Many, understandably, cared a great deal. The border ran along the southern, in the strictly geographical context, but in the political context, eastern, side of the Bernauer Strasse, leaving the buildings on the northern side and the entire roadway as part of West Berlin, but starting from the thresholds of the buildings on the south side, facing the actual apartment blocks in East Berlin. Those who lived in West Berlin, directly on the sector border, found their daily routine suddenly devastating. They were used to shopping in the east, the children to going roller skating after school at the rink in the Gartenstrasse, or on Sundays picnicking at the Märchenburg, fairy tale factory, in the nearby Friedrichshafen public park. Even their church, the 19th century Church of Reconciliation, Versöhnungskirche, was situated in the east, though its front porch opened out onto the west. Until its demolition, the church was doomed to its pathetic non-existence in Paradise. Elke Kielberg, then 13, lived on the corner of Cirencester and Bernauer Strasse, and still does. The closest neighbour, since Elke remained an only child, almost a sister, was her cousin who lived across the street. The closely related families were, of course, constantly in and out of each other's flats. The first inkling of catastrophe came at 8 o'clock on Sunday the 13th of August, when Elke's mother went out to buy the newspaper. She returned to their apartment distraught and outraged. The streets that ran at right hand of the Bernauerstrasse in the direction of Berlin Mitte, Ackerstrasse, Gartenstrasse, Cirencester, had all been closed off with barbed wire. There were eastern police with guns blocking access. Already, paramilitary workers seemed busy constructing a more permanent barrier. The Kierbergs had been planning to drop over to their relatives for coffee later that day. But now those on the southern side of the street, including Elke's cousin and her family, were immured in East Berlin. Barbed Wire Sunday, as Berliners called it, would mark the greatest change in most of these people's lives. Ordinary streets became traps, sometimes death traps. This is why, within hours of waking to the new reality of a divided Berlin, many of those trapped in the East made frantic, last-minute attempts to make the journey that just hours before would have involved a simple crossing of the street. The Benauerstrasse was the scene of people jumping from the windows of apartment blocks, which were part of the East, down into the street, all of which belonged to the West. The Vopos and Grepos, realizing the potential for escapes, had begun entering these buildings. Their ultimate aim was to clear the immediate sector border area of unreliable elements, but this would take time. The escapes in the Benauerstrasse soon turned into a human drama watched by an entire world which, through the cameras of the press and the recently established television stations, enjoyed a grandstand seat. Crowds, police and firefighters arrived on the western side. They shouted encouragement as Easterners hesitated at upstairs windows. Firefighters extended jumping sheets to break escapers' falls. In one case, as a man slid from a first-floor window, he found himself seized by Vopos from inside the room he had just left. The Westerners in the street below managed to grab his ankles and pull him down. A tug of war ensued. In this case, with gravity on their side, the escaper and his Western helpers won. Others were not so lucky. A number of would-be escapers died in the hours and days before the buildings were cleared. Dieter Siegmann, 59 years old, fell into the west from an upper floor and died, as did Rudolf Urban, 47, who suffered terrible damage after a fall from his apartment window. He lingered almost a month in a West Berlin hospital before succumbing to his injuries. Even after the windows were bricked up, people tried to escape over the apartment block roofs. One of the last victims in the Benauerstrasse was Bernd Lunzer, a Berliner who on the 4th of October was spotted by Grepos as he prepared to abseil from the roof of 44 Benauerstrasse to the west using a washing line. East German police rapidly appeared in the building. Lunzer was forced to move elsewhere, pursued across the rooftop by the representatives of the communist state. All the while he called out for help from the west. Below on the street, the fire brigade set up a jump sheet. Several hundred Western onlookers assembled. As the police closed in, Lunzer sprang from the roof. He missed the sheet and died on the ground minutes later. He was 30 years old. There was as yet no wall in place, as it would later be understood. But even the improvised barrier erected during the night of the 12th and 13th of August proved surprisingly effective. The Marienfelde reception centre in West Berlin remained full of refugees, but mostly ones who had arrived before Sunday and were awaiting processing. On Monday, when registration began, several thousand fugitives presented themselves, but they were mostly East Germans who had been visiting West Berlin for the weekend and decided to stay after the border was closed. The same applied to the few hundred who registered on Tuesday. 28 escapers, according to official figures, managed to make it over during Sunday night, and 41 the next. Some swam the Terntow Canal. Another, a 50-year-old railway worker, Alphonse Dubinsky, managed to sneak through the no-man's land covering the remains of Hitler's Reichschancellery and find his way through the barbed wire fence of the Ebertstrasse into the Tiergarten and the safety of West Berlin. On Monday night, shots were fired at a couple swimming the as yet sparsely fortified Terntow Canal towards the American sector. No one was hurt, and they had made it safely to the west. But it was a grim warning of what might happen to future would-be escapers. Again, the East German regime's leaders could congratulate themselves on their success in carrying out their mission with minimum cost. And they did. The party's official mouthpiece, Neues Deutschland, crowed over the triumph that the anti-fascist protection barrier represented. This was a black day for the warmongers. The track switch has been set to peace. The workers' response, production records. A front-page editorial was headlined, Clear Conditions. Instead of the West Berlin authorities, With one stroke, it becomes evident how bankrupt is their policy, how hopeless their position. A crestfallen Brandt, according to a report of his rallying speech to the people of West Berlin, had held a funeral oration for the traders in human beings. To a young journalist on the paper and convinced communist, Günter Schabowski, this feeling of triumph was genuine. The regime he supported had won a wonderful victory. It had outwitted the capitalists, and for him and his colleagues, this was a great day. Beneath the facade of self-congratulation, though, the SED state was as insecure and paranoid as ever. The party was never satisfied. It was not enough that the GDR's citizens were quiescent. They had to love the party and everything it did. Those who could be regarded as not loving the party were both obvious and less obvious. Obvious were the tens of thousands who had previously chosen to work in the West. They were the so-called border crossers. The regime had been persecuting them for years, with every measure short of an outright ban. Equally obvious were those young East Berliners who had chosen, or their parents had chosen for them, to be educated in the West. Less obvious were those who put on a positive face in the workplace or at compulsory political meetings, but in private complained. Now that the party had all these people in its clutches, unable to leave via the escape hatch of the open Berlin border, its policy towards all of them could and would change. The former border crossers were easily dealt with. They were directed to labour exchanges to be found work in East German factories, but their status as doubtful elements would still cost them dear. They were subjected to a policy of discrimination. Concentrations of such people in workplaces were to be avoided. They were not to be employed in key positions and especially crucial areas of production. By the middle of September, the Stasi reported that of 32,000 registered former border crossers, 24,000 had accepted new employment within democratic, i.e. East Berlin. Significantly, and given the regime's preoccupations, and surprisingly, all qualified teachers who were resident in the East but had taught in the West were to be barred from the GDR's education system for life. As for so-called Weststudenten, West students, who had chosen to study in West Berlin or West Germany during the time of the open border, they were also to be punished. An element of class war was clearly present in handling those who might be seen as privileged traitors to the workers and peasant state. Such college or university students were categorically not to be permitted to finish their studies in the East. Those studying technical subjects were to be directed into jobs in socialist industry, where their knowledge might be exploited. They might, after a while, with the agreement of their managers, be allowed to return to higher education in the GDR. Those who had studied what might be called liberal arts subjects were to be treated with special vindictiveness. As the order put it, West students who have been studying a social science subject in West Berlin, including those in their final semester, are to be placed without exception into the production process. In other words, anyone who had studied political subject matter in the West was to be put straight into unskilled factory work. A thornier problem was that of children and young people from the East who had attended schools in the West before the 13th of August and would now have to finish their studies in the GDR. Here, fear of contamination was a major determining factor. If there were concerns about politically tainted border crossers undermining innocent socialist factories, there were equal worries about these corrupted young people poisoning pure socialist schools. A concentration of former West pupils in individual classes or schools was absolutely to be avoided. Questions of convenience or proximity to a particular school should not mitigate this policy. At least most of the younger pupils were to be allowed to continue studying. Things got tougher as the subjects of the rule got older. In the case of West pupils from the 11th and 12th classes, the last but two and penultimate year of high school, they would not be allowed to finish school, but would be assigned apprenticeships. No access to university, except in cases where this was considered appropriate appropriate in the interests of society as a whole, which would decisively depend on the attitude of parents with regard to our government's measures and their willingness to help educate their children in accordance with our educational laws. The price for possible educational reprieve for their children was therefore the total abject conformity of the parents. West pupils in the 13th pre-university year were, like the errant social science students, to be tossed straight into the workforce with no chance of higher education. Although, or perhaps because, the East German regime distrusted the educated middle classes so strongly, the attitude of the intelligentsia, of whatever age, was a matter of intense concern to the authorities. Papers submitted to the Central Committee included surveys based on informants' reports detailing the educated classes' concerns. There were doctors complaining about the sudden shortage of Western medicines and fears that they would no longer be able to treat some private patients along with the state-supported ones. There were actors who considered themselves cut off from their German heritage. There were self-employed members of the middle classes who feared that the government would now clamp down on their independence. "Why do they ask us now?" one complaint went. "This business, i.e. the building of the wall, was a foregone conclusion. There should be consultation and discussion first to see if we agree. That is democracy." This view was reported to be widespread in educated circles. Occasionally, criticism went public. At a chemical works in Halle, open dissent was expressed at a meeting to discuss the 13th of August border closure. Workers declared that the measures were a crime. The report certainly described the consequences of such frankness. 2 bandits were consequently arrested. Elsewhere, a certain colleague Richter announced that he did not agree with the measures which he said would harm the GDR. His own life, he declared, was in any case already ruined, per push. In this case, the government informant confined himself to enclosing photographs of the ruined man's pleasant apartment and penning a few sarcastic remarks. "Richter also possesses a Trabant Deluxe automobile," the report noted, "a refrigerator, a television set, new furniture for his apartment, and 2 fat pigs." The choice of a weekend for the sealing of the border was calculated to catch the West asleep, but it also aimed at managing the response among the domestic workforce. In June 1953, during the uprising, workers had downed tools to discuss their grievances, then streamed out of factories and construction sites onto the streets. It had taken Soviet tanks to quell their resistance. The party had learned a bitter lesson. On an August Sunday, it was calculated those same workers would be with their families, relaxing at home, perhaps visiting their traditional German weekend allotments, Gartenlauben, or even off on vacation in the countryside. Much less likelihood of mass meetings and strikes. By Monday, the East German authorities reasoned the fait accompli would be unassailable. They were right. Unlike 1953, the government arranged for meetings to be addressed by party officials and agitators, and for discussion to be tolerated. Iron glove in velvet fist. Only critics who went too far, like the fearless workers in Halle, were classified as bandits or negative elements. They were scooped up by the security forces. There were thousands who did come into that category. Around 1,500 East Germans were arrested for political offences in the first half of 1961. That number increased almost 5-fold in the second half to 7,200. As reigns of terror go, it was not comparable to 1953, when the jails had brimmed over, but it was bad enough. Those swept up by this purge entered a world that was little known to outsiders or even most GDR citizens, but that they would, if they survived it, never forget. The East German Gulag. At the end of that weekend, 19-year-old Klaus Schutz-Ladegast returned to the city from his romantic rural interlude. He settled back into the comfortable family home in the inner-city East Berlin district of Mitte. In the meantime, of course, Barbed Wire Sunday had intervened, and the great world had changed. So had Schutz-Ladegast's small and personal world, though he did not yet know this. Because he had no overwhelming feelings about the new border measures, the woman he was in love with also lived east of the New Barrier, he assumed his life would continue along much the same course. Considering where to study, meeting his lover and his friends, hanging out in the cafes and bars of the city's historic centre. It was not to be. 5 days later, on Thursday the 17th of August, they came for him. A car slid in alongside the curb as he walked down a quiet suburban street in the August sunshine. 2 men got out, and he found his way blocked. They asked him to accompany them, to clear up a matter. Their polite language belied the firmness with which they took him by the arms and bundled him into the waiting Wartburg. A third man had kept the engine idling while the arrest took place. He now pumped the accelerator, and the car took off quickly, rumbling over the cobbled street to God knew where. Schultz Ladergast's destination was a place that since the 1950s had been known as the Forbidden Area. Catching the ordinary tram that started at the Alexanderplatz and trundled eastwards 5 or so kilometres along the broad boulevard of the Leninallee, the casual traveller would get out at the Genslerstrasse stop. Only when one tried to enter the small maze of streets north of the Leninallee did orientation difficulties begin. The area was one of mixed residential and light industrial use in the Hohenschönhausen sub-district of Lichtenberg. This was a busy outer district of East Berlin, yet a substantial part of it appeared in no city guide. Nearby streets were marked, but, on maps printed in East Berlin throughout the GDR's existence, they simply stopped, and a blank area was shown. Even on Western maps, there were only vague outlines of buildings, plus a small goods station that had been there since before the war. On the ground, had our traveller persisted in trying to find his or her way north from the Genslerstrasse tram stop, they would have reached a high wall festooned with warning signs. Had they turned into the Freienwalderstrasse, they would have seen a stop sign, a checkpoint manned by armed guards in the uniform of the East German Ministry of State Security, and a set of high, panelled steel barriers blocking further progress along the street. This was the main entrance to the Forbidden Area. A section of this industrial area, covering half a square kilometre, had been Jewish-owned before 1933 and was expropriated under the Nazis. This benefited the expansion of one local Aryan business, a large-scale button factory that flourished on contracts for the Wehrmacht. Other favoured companies included the Heikler plant, which manufactured meat processing machinery, a pharmaceutical factory producing vaccination materials. The Nazi welfare organisation, the NSB, built a modern canteen kitchen, Großküche, on the site, capable of providing thousands of meals for the local population under the aegis of the Winter Aid Fund. These facilities were extensively damaged by Allied air raids. Also affected by bombing were a small punishment camp run by the Gestapo on the Genslerstrasse, where Jews and conscripted workers from Eastern Europe were sent if they failed to fulfill their norms, and a Wehrmacht-owned warehouse used to store looted goods from occupied Europe. On the 22nd of April, the 5th Army of the White Russian Front, under the command of General Betzarin, overran Hohenschönhausen. Huge amounts of warehoused materials, plus most of the equipment from the canteen kitchen, went missing. So far, an average fate for a typical suburban industrial development of that time and place. The peculiarity of this district, however, was that the Soviet People's Commissariat for Interior Affairs, the NKVD, predecessor of the notorious KGB, chose to set up its headquarters precisely here. With the aid of local communists and other variously motivated informers, the Soviets began to round up those in the locality who had been guilty of supporting Hitler, especially the bourgeoisie. On the 23rd of April 1945, 80-year-old Richard Heikler, owner of the meat processing machinery factory, was identified to a Soviet patrol and shot dead on the spot, on the corner of Freienwalderstrasse and Genslerstrasse, along with his housekeeper and a family friend. It was the kind of impromptu revenge killing common all over Eastern Germany in those tumultuous weeks. But soon such casual executions would be succeeded by a systematic purge. Richard Heikler Jr. son of the dead meat processing magnate, was arrested and disappeared forever to a labour camp in the Soviet Union. Several other managers were imprisoned. Soon the NKVD requisitioned what remained of the Gestapo camp and the canteen kitchen. This area was, in mid-May 1945, officially designated Special Camp Number 3. One Major Smaroda of the NKVD was made its commandant. Many thousands, prominent and obscure, suffered similar fates to Heinrich Jr. The most famous was the actor Heinrich Georg, star of the 1920s film classics Metropolis and Barely Alexander. He had once been an opponent of the Nazis, but had allowed himself to be subdued by Goebbels and became a leading figure in the Third Reich's film culture. Georg was imprisoned in June-July 1945 before being transferred to the former Nazi concentration camp Sachsenhausen just outside Berlin. There he died a year later. In the spring of 1951, Special Camp Number 3, now expanded to include almost all the half-square kilometre industrial area, was handed over by the Soviets to the new East German Ministry of State Security. The area of the canteen kitchen and the former Gestapo punishment camp became the Stasi's main interrogation prison. The area was peculiarly suited to this use. It was relatively isolated, easily closed off. The buildings were conveniently configured, and, last but not least, into the midst of the location ran a branch railway line. The goods transported could just as well be human beings as machines consumed durable. On Thursday, the 17th of August, 1961, scooped up off the street by Stasi operatives, Klaus Schultz-Ladegast came to Warwickshire passing by car. He had been blindfolded shortly after his journey began, so what he experienced at his arrival was the end of the cobbled street and the sound of a gate opening. Then he heard the car cross the flagstone area and pass through another metal gate. Schultz-Ladegast now realized from the echo that they were inside a contained space. The gate clanged shut. The blindfold was removed. The lights were dazzling. As Schultz-Ladegast was dragged out of the car, a terrifying chorus of shouting came from unseen voices. He was hauled through this din towards the door. The calculated psychological nightmare of Stasi interrogation custody had begun. The interrogation prison of Cheltenham, as it existed in 1961, was part of a wider complex. It was not just a prison, but also a Stasi administrative centre and a specialist labour camp. Elsewhere within the complex, long-term prisoners made false Western number plates that were used by Stasi employees operating in the capitalist abroad. Plus, there was a print shop for documents, forms and ID papers, legitimate and otherwise. In the 1950s, tools of the spying trade, such as miniature cameras and recorders, had also been manufactured here, but the Department of Special Campaigns had been closed down after information was leaked to the Western press. The interrogation prison was different. It concentrated solely on getting out of suspects what the state needed to justify the usually preordained verdicts that secret courts would inflict on them. Klaus was one among many operatives. The way he was dealt with by his jailers, Department 14 of the Stasi, responsible for the running of multiple prisons, was fairly typical. On arrival, after the routine ordeal of reception, he was stripped and put into rough prison fatigues. Then he was marched to an isolation cell. Moving around the interrogation prison was a strict, carefully monitored procedure. Especially in the early stages of incarceration, no prisoner was permitted to converse or even see another. A system of traffic lights at corners in the midst of gloomy corridors warned if another detainee and his escort were approaching. If this was the case, the original prisoner would be pushed into a man-sized niche specially dug into the wall, where he would have to stand, face pressed against the dark brickwork, until the other prisoner and his escort had safely passed. The cell itself, when the prisoner reached it, consisted of just a bed and a latrine. A frosted glass window letting a little natural light, and no view of the outside. The entire place was desperately lonely, eerily silent. The prisoner, especially one like Klaus, who had just arrived from the fresh air of the outside world, would soon feel as if he was being slowly buried alive. Klaus's experiences at Pershore House, and later at the notorious Yellow Misery, as the Baltzen prison in Saxony was known, 4 years in all, would mark him for life. He was sentenced for knowingly having introduced to his father a man from West German intelligence who wanted to discuss the affairs of the Brandenburg Church community. His father had resisted at first, then agreed. The West German agent had been very firm. Neither father or son should ever mention their meetings with him to anyone at all. Klaus's father thought this could not apply in the case of his best friend and colleague at the church council, with whom, certain that they shared similar political sympathies, he discussed the meetings. However, this apparent soulmate was in fact a Stasi agent, specifically assigned to him as a lifer. Hence the arrest of Klaus, and, unknown to him, also his father on that Thursday 5 days after the war went on. Father and son underwent the same torment of isolation and interrogation. The methods used on each were similar. A mild threat of violence at times, though not actually used. Stasi methods in the 1950s had frequently been brutally similar to those of the NKVD and KGB, but paradoxically, after the outrage of barbed wire Sunday, East Germany began to seek international respectability, which encouraged the Stasi to switch mostly to psychological methods. The classic scenario was the corner-to-corner interrogation room. The room was on the second floor and overlooked the edge of the prison, allowing a tantalizing glimpse of the outside world. The interrogator's chair and desk were situated at an angle with this window corner, facing into the room. When the prisoner was brought in, he was placed on an uncomfortable small stool in the far interior corner of the room, so that he crouched there, facing the interrogator, who was a good 10 feet away. The psychological effect, which had been thoroughly researched, was to make the prisoner instantly uncomfortable and apprehensive, subject to an animal unease, which the interrogator could increase by simply staring at him and saying things like, "I have plenty of time. I have nothing but time." It was clear to the prisoner that, just out of his line of vision, a window revealed the world he had left weeks or months previously for a lonely, silent cell. Often the prisoner felt an overwhelming sense to talk, to make something happen that would get him off that stool and out of it. Many gave in to this compulsion. Klaus talked, but he did not tell his interrogators what they wanted. He instinctively denied everything about the West German spies, though he fed his jailers a lot about his life as a gadfly in the East Berlin social scene, and his regular visits to places like the fashionable press cafe and Friedrichstrasse. Luckily, he had never taken money from the West Germans, so they could prove nothing in that regard. This game of drip-feeding important-sounding but actually trivial information helped keep Klaus sane. 2 other things also helped. First, within a month of arriving, he found himself afflicted with violent stomach pains and had to be taken into hospital. There, though kept in an enclosed wing, he got 2 weeks of better food, relatively normal treatment, including the attentions of pleasant young nurses, and a breathing space. Schultz Ladegast returned to the prison after recovering from the probably psychosomatic illness much strengthened. Then he was moved into a cell with another prisoner, an older man who had served in the Wehrmacht. His cellmate taught him a few survival tricks, how to handle interrogators, and above all, how to keep that vital element of self-respect while remaining within the rules. He told Klaus never to obey a guard's order immediately. They discussed how to judge that split-second pause when ordered to do something by a guard. A split-second pause that allowed the prisoner to make the guard wait, while at the same time avoiding punishment for disobedience. On such fine behavioural detail depended a prisoner's sense of his own dignity, and therefore his emotional survival. The original sentence intended for Klaus had been 8 years, as he later found out from viewing his Stasi file. Through his skill at the interrogation game, he had managed, Klaus noted with grim satisfaction, to get that down to 4. Klaus survived Hohenschönhausen. He survived a further 3 years at Bautzen. It would be almost 10 years before he once more set foot on Western soil, a changed man, and in a different country. While the wall existed, he never again set eyes on the woman he had fallen in love with that summer. Ironically, his father had had his freedom purchased by West German benefactors years earlier. He was one of the first East German political prisoners released by this route. It was a sign that the East German Gulag would, unique among the prison systems of the Eastern Bloc, become a trading organization, exchanging human beings for hard currency. The sealing of the border had been a sudden coup, crude but effective in execution. Once the wire and the guards were in place, the fortifications would be intensified and the more durable structure that would be known as the wall put in place. Meanwhile, the dissidents and the amateur spies, such as Klaus, could be scooped up and dealt with. And behind the new barrier, other inconvenient details could be tidied up. In the Bernauerstrasse and the neighbouring streets, as autumn 1961 turned into winter, the regime finished removing residents from the houses and apartment blocks adjoining the new border, especially in the Mitte district. Of the total of 497 households that made up the Bernauerstrasse, reckoned to total 826 individuals, in the 5 weeks until the 19th of September, 143 families, 276 individuals were removed to other accommodations. It was planned that by the 21st of October, the other 354 families, 530 individuals, would also be gone. This would leave the area safe from escape attempts on the part of its residents, due to the simple fact that there would no longer be any residents. The same went for border areas in Pershore. On the 13th of August, Till Meyer had seen East Berliners waving and shouting from their apartments in the Cirencester to their Western friends and relatives on the other side of the barbed wire. This was no longer possible after the 15th of October. By then, 42 families, 108 persons were removed from those very same apartment blocks in the Cirencester. Elsewhere in that small complex of streets adjoining the West Berlin borough of Kreuzberg, a further 134 households were also due for deportation. The cold numbers cited in the official reports fail to express the angry, desperate reality of human beings forced from homes they had occupied for years, perhaps even for their whole lives. These were famously close Berlin neighborhoods. All the worse for their inhabitants to be torn from everything that was familiar and dumped into the company of strangers, often in the soulless new high-rise concrete slab housing developments that the regime was busily building on the eastern edge of the city. This happened in many streets close to the border. Some of the inhabitants had to be ejected by force. One resident, whose home lay on the border with West Berlin at Spandau, having initially left peacefully enough, later returned to his flat and, being in a drunken condition, smashed to pieces several window panes and a stove. Another family tried to ignore the Vopos knocking on their door and calling out at 6 a.m., so that the apartment had to be opened up by force. Another young woman was arrested for protesting, acting in a provocative manner, as the official description had it. Eventually, the buildings on the Bernauerstrasse, as elsewhere on the East Berlin-West Berlin border, were entirely demolished. No more dramatic escapes from windows, no more abseiling from the roof, no more desperate fugitives plummeting to their deaths on the cobbled street below. Nothing was to get in the way of the new impregnable wall. It would keep the state citizens trapped inside the GDR until, like the detainees in the interrogation prison, they resigned themselves to their fate and simply stopped resisting. Chapter 11. That Bastard from Berlin. Part 1. When Joe Alsop dropped by that high-octane Georgetown dinner party late on the evening of Saturday the 12th of August 1961, and told young Berlin journalist Lothar Löwe of the dramatic events in his native city, the veteran Washington communicator had taken his information from the American broadcast media. News was trickling out about the new communist challenge in Berlin, even though, in the untidy way of information gathering, few people, even on the spot, were sure exactly what that challenge consisted of. A little later that same Saturday night, John C. Osland, duty officer for the Berlin task force of the State Department, was woken by his bedside phone at his home in Washington. On the line was the night officer from the department's recently established operations center. The man informed Osland that garbled news about some kind of communist move in Berlin was starting to come over the wire service's teletype network. There was talk of sector border crossings being blockaded, but it was not clear what this entailed. Temporary restrictions by the east of cross-sector traffic within Greater Berlin had happened before, of course. Osland told his caller to stay in touch and went back to sleep. Around 4 a.m. Washington time on Sunday, already 10 in the morning in West Berlin, the night duty man called Osland back. Military channels had confirmed that this was a total blockade between East and West Berlin. So, astonishingly, a full 10 hours after Operation Rosa had begun, Washington started to get the message. Osland called several different people, including Frank Cash, a former senior official at the embassy in Bonn, who was running the Berlin task force, while German expert Martin Hillebrand was on summer leave. Cash said he had to take his family to the airport in a couple of hours, but promised he would be in later. Osland was soon joined by Colonel Showalter, the Pentagon's liaison officer at the State Department, and more calls to Europe were made. However, the one thing they really wanted to do, they could not. Call the American mission in Berlin. This was because the phone line in question went right through East German territory. Any conversation would have been totally en clair and would assuredly have been tapped by East German intelligence. At 6, with dawn breaking over Washington, Osland picked up the telephone and found the White House duty officer on the line. Word had finally got through about events in Berlin, but the man expressed reluctance to wake the president, who was staying out at Cape Cod for the weekend. White House official assured Osland that he would start taking steps to alert Kennedy at the more civilized hour of 8 a.m. EST. It was by now noon on Sunday in Berlin. Operation Rosa was 12 hours old, and still the American president knew nothing of it. This hesitance to bother Kennedy may not have represented just the traditional reluctance of servants to displease their master. The president was in for shame. As became known after his death, Kennedy's public image as a young paragon of masculine power, glowing with health, was largely a sham. He had suffered since young adulthood from Addison's disease, a debilitating affliction of the autoimmune system, which among other unpleasant symptoms caused stomach problems, exhaustion, depression, and severe joint and back pain. For more than a quarter of a century, Kennedy had been on constant medication. In the summer of 1961, his health problems were especially severe. At that time, his personal physician was injecting him with cocaine, a serious narcotic, 2 or 3 times a day to allay the pains. Cortisone shots were, moreover, a routine treatment for Addison's, and the president was also regularly addressed with colitis, weight loss, testosterone, and insomnia written. On the 9th of August 1961, Kennedy had complained of gut problems, cramps, and loose stool. He had woken at 5 in the morning of Friday the 11th of August with severe abdominal discomfort. JFK was, as a doctor who later reviewed his medical records stated, tired because it was being dogged up. That fateful Sunday, as the wires hung with the news from Berlin, America's most powerful elected official was indeed fast asleep. He was staying at the Kennedy family compound in Hyat's Court, where he and a small staff had joined the extended First Family for the weekend, as the president liked to do in the dog days of summer. It was beautiful weather. A family trip on the Kennedy's cabinet reserve at Mali was planned for later that morning. At this time of the year, the president usually left for Cape on a Friday afternoon, travelling by helicopter to Andrews Air Force Base, and from there to Cape Cod by plane. As usual, on that last morning in Washington, he would have been presented by his senior military aide, Major General Chester Lindquist, with a folder containing CIA reports on developments in various parts of the world that day. The The folder was known as the President's checklist. Looking through this was part of Kennedy's daily routine. Update folders would be flown to Highness Port on Saturday, and then again on Sunday, along with any other material thought significant, so that the President could continue to keep up with current events. Urgent messages could be routed via a telex loop from the White House to the basement of the Yachtsman's Motel in Highness Port, where a unit of the US Signal Corps was installed for the summer. On Sunday the 13th of August, the President finally arrived. Blue skies and sunshine, a glorious Cape Cod morning. Despite the White House officials' promise, it seems that no clear message had arrived about the situation in Berlin. There was still no word when Kennedy set off to attend Mass with the rest of the family in St. Francois Xavier Church at Highness Port. The Kennedys returned a little less than an hour later and almost immediately embarked on the line. They were headed for Great Island, where they had been invited to lunch with the director of Washington's National Capital Bar, Mrs. White. A short while later, a radio message came from General Clifton, who had remained behind at the Kennedy compound. The cable had been delivered to Washington. Berlin was being sealed off. Clifton recommended that the President return to shore. The Marlin turned back. Kennedy was dropped onto the compact jetty, where Clifton met him in a motor-pressed lobby. At the President's insistence, the first family continued with their cruise after lunch. Clifton immediately showed Kennedy the cable that drove him back across the dunes to the family's holiday cottage. There the President put in a call to the State Department. Within a few minutes, he was discussing the Berlin situation with Secretary Wilson. The Secretary of State, in the calm, inscrutable tones that had earned him the nickname of Woody, explained that he thought it was important to negotiate to mark the feeble balance. The President wanted to know what the Russians were up to. Rusk said it appeared they were taking military measures, right, but only defensive ones. Nothing indicated that Khrushchev was out to gobble up West Berlin. That was the main point. The World War of access to from East Berlin. The instinctive impulse of Rusk and his aides, and of everyone around the President, was to play down the news, at least for public consumption. Phone calls from Kennedy to McNamara, Bundy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy confirmed that this low-key approach reflected a general consensus. No one wanted to appear weak or unresponsive. On the other hand, they didn't want to make it look as if the Soviet East German measures were a casus belli or anything like it. Nonetheless, some kind of official reaction had to occur. Lord Rostow, who was in Washington and could help set up the situation, joined Wilson in drafting a press release. This was cabled through to the President's press secretary, Pierre Salinger, at Highness Port, so that Salinger could feel the media's inquiries to make whatever statements were considered necessary. There was no talk of a war or anything similar in the press release, only of designed to avoid the flow of refugees to West Berlin. The East German moves were seen as a continuation of intimidatory actions undertaken earlier that weekend against travellers from Potsdam and East Berlin, thought to be aimed at border crossings. The main task would be to deny that the West had done anything to reduce the flood of refugees due to economic conditions in East Germany in the Soviet campaign against West Berlin. From there, Salinger went on the offensive, pointing out that the restrictions were in direct contravention of the four-power agreement and represented a damning admission by the Soviets of the inability of communist society to compete with a free society. The official State Department response, discussed and approved by the President, eschewed even such anodyne rhetoric. It declared merely that the action did not affect the Allied position in West Berlin or access thereto, though it violated existing agreements and would be subject to vigorous protests through appropriate channels. Soviet tanks might be on the outskirts of Berlin. Machine gun-wielding communist goons might defy humanity. Western crowds might come close to rioting at the sector border. Malevolent agents of the Stasi might be busy forcibly crushing resistance among the recalcitrant East Berliners. But in Washington, the State Department reacted with polite romance. Kennedy was not alone in confronting the undoubted ugliness of Operation Rosa with extreme caution. other major Western leaders were even less eager to confront the communist machinations of Berlin head-on. The crisis found Harold Macmillan, British Prime Minister of Great Britain since 1957, hundreds of miles north of London at Bolton Abbey, Yorkshire. There he was celebrating, as he did every summer, the opening of the grouse shooting season. Macmillan spent Saturday the 12th of August in the company of his nephew, the Duke of Devonshire, over at Bolton Abbey, and much else besides, engaged in appropriate use of firearms and individuals. After hearing the news from Berlin, the Premier saw no reason why he should not continue to do so on the 13th of August also. Meanwhile, 71-year-old General Charles-André Joseph Marie de Gaulle, last active Allied leader of the Second World War, and since 1958 once more President of France, was resting at his country following the Pacific southeast, in fact, rather a long way southeast of Paris. So relaxed did de Gaulle seem about the Berlin affair that he failed to return to Paris on the following Thursday, the 17th of August. This caution was not due to mere indifference on the part of each Britain. Each had problems of his own, quite independent of Khrushchev or British war. Britain's military and economic decline had lately accelerated to a point where even the traditionally imperialistic conservatives realized they had become a block to support circumstances. The certain tested obsession with cost had crept into discussions about Britain's military readiness. Even before the status of Western political crisis, plans had been put in motion by Defence Minister Howard Hopkins not to increase Britain's military presence in East Germany and Berlin, but to drastically reduce it. Conscription for the British Armed Services was due to be abandoned in the early part of 1962. The strength of the British Army of the Rhine, BARR, would accordingly fall from 52,000 to 44,000 by the end of that year. It seemed likely that even the 3,500 troops London maintained in the British sector of Berlin might be subjected to a quiet culling operation. Despite occasional saber-rattling from America and the USSR, and the manifest failure of the Vienna summit in June, until the 13th of August, the attitude in London was pretty low-key. Macmillan, in his wry way, expressed the general feeling among London's elite in June 1961. I still think we are more likely to be bankrupted than blown up. Moreover, problems elsewhere in the world, in the Middle East, the British faced confrontation with the newly radicalized Republic of Iraq under its fiery strongman, Brigadier Abdul Karim Qassem. Qassem had laid claim to the small British protectorate and oil-rich Sheikhdom of Kuwait, and had spent most of June massing his army in the arid border zone. London had hastily withdrawn substantial forces from Germany, Cyprus, and the Home Command to defend the Kuwait flashpoint. The cost of such a major, if temporary, movement of personnel and equipment, including ships and aircraft, was extremely painful for the British Treasury. But Macmillan's diplomats were still frantically occupied with arranging for peacekeeping forces from the Arab League to take over the long-term protection of Kuwait, while British conscripts sweated at temperatures of 50 degrees centigrade, 120 degrees Fahrenheit, opposite Iraq's fugitive military might in the desert south of Basra. Before the 13th of August, Berlin was therefore not high on London's priorities list. But this seemed in any case to be dictated by financial considerations rather than global security. For the past several years, Britain had been locked in a wrangle with West Germany. London wanted Bonn to share more of the cost of the British presence there, formerly an army of occupation, but now part of the first line of defence against attack from the east. This had become a touchy point. In mid-July, during discussions about contingency plans in the case of another Soviet blockade of Berlin, Macmillan had declared rather sourly that Britain should make it clear that we will pay nothing toward the expenses of any new air. So trouble in Berlin was the last thing the British wanted. Even in the aftermath of the war, another personal communication to Macmillan from his Minister of Defence stated that, "From our own domestic point of view, I am now convinced that we can no longer afford, either from a military or from a foreign exchange point of view, to keep anything like the present level of forces in Europe. A measure of disengagement toward détente would, therefore, serve not only the cause of peace, but our own special and urgent needs. A scribbled comment on the memo by McMillan declared, agreement with your thesis, and added, I think Forsett, presumably Foreign Secretary, is also exhibited. As for that other overstretched former imperial power, France still had several 100,000 troops, mostly young conscripts, tied up in a vicious guerrilla war in Algeria. Towards the end, the bloody Algerian struggle for independence from France had just begun in the spa town of Evian. A concession by de Gaulle but had already brought sections of his army and the Algerian white settlers out in open rebellion. It would be late the following spring before a ceasefire resulted. With France's largest overseas province in bloody uproar, diverting serious reinforcements to join the 45,000 French troops already in Germany, of which 3,000 were based in the Quartier de Bouillon military complex in Berlin, was out of the question. Although, unlike Macmillan's hard-headed and hard-out Britain, de Gaulle's France was prepared to make considerable sacrifices for greatness, its readiness did not apply, as would soon become clear, when it came to the unity of Berlin. When the American president passed through Paris on his way to meet Khrushchev in May 1961, General de Gaulle, playing the experienced father figure, told Kennedy to remain firm on Berlin and not let Khrushchev hoodwink him. De Gaulle tended to advocate a tough line over Berlin, both because he wanted to court the West Germans and because this was, in his experience, how one best dealt with the Russians and their puppets. He had a particular contempt for the East German regime. Nonetheless, the French Defense Minister, Pierre Mesmer, informed his British counterpart just weeks later that Frenchmen were not prepared to die for Berlin. Privately, the French elite still found the existing division of Berlin and of Germany perfectly satisfactory, although, in the delicate words of a recent French official publication, de Gaulle thought that it was important to avoid dashing the hopes of the Germans. Another great Frenchman, the Nobel Prize-winning author and biographer of de Gaulle, François Mauriac, would later make the classic quip that, I like Germany so much, I want two of her. Only an attempt to encroach on existing Allied and especially French occupation rights would therefore provoke de Gaulle into unsheathing his sword. Guarded remarks over the telephone line to and from Pilot's Port that August Sunday were therefore not just an expression of timidity on the part of Kennedy and his aides. The administration was walking a diplomatic tightrope act. Its caution reflected the complexity not just of dealing with the Soviet Union and its puppets, but also, and simultaneously, with the Western Allies, whose needs, capabilities, and national ambitions varied. Unlike Khrushchev's satellites, the European democracies could not simply be browbeaten into place to suit their dominant superpowers' needs. They had to be persuaded into unanimity, and were not yet so convinced. The administration and its advisers had sensed these problems in the period before the building of the wall. Walt Rostow summed it up in a memorandum to the President on the 22nd of July, which may have influenced the carefully calculated toughness of Kennedy's television broadcast about Berlin 3 days earlier. The advice, self-consciously entitled The High Noon Stance on Berlin, argued that while the US should carry its allies with it into a firm position if possible, especially the Germans and the French, the British are not mentioned, it must be prepared, if necessary, to go the distance alone. Hence the high noon stance. As Rostow added dryly, you recall Gary Cooper dealt with the bandits alone. While understanding why the Europeans, after two costly wars, would be less willing to risk conflict, Rostow also declared the unquestionable but unpalatable truth that it is on the United States, its will and its power, that the Russians will ultimately focus. The final formula will be heavily determined by what we will take or not take. He continued, I may be wrong. It may be that the importance of Atlantic unity and the inescapable moral commitment of the West Berliners will see us all together, right down to the final test. And of course, the crisis may abort at a relatively early stage. But I do believe we must be prepared in our minds for the possibility of a relatively lonely stage, and we should accept it without throwing our sheriff's badge in the dust when the crisis subsides. But it wasn't just the big Western allies that America had to deal with. Washington also had to consider smaller NATO members, such as Italy, Belgium, Holland, Norway, and so on down to tiny Luxembourg, who had no military presence in Berlin or West Germany, but who voted in the alliance's councils. The smaller NATO powers could reasonably argue that, in a war waged over Berlin with atomic weapons, they would suffer as much as those who were directly involved. Therefore, they should have a say in America's and NATO's response to the communist provocation of the 13th of August. The White House was acutely aware of this fact. It also was forced to ask a related question, having relied throughout the 1950s on the deterrent effect of America's atomic arsenal to keep the Soviets from launching an all-out invasion of Western Europe. What role did the atomic arsenal have in handling the more insidious